Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we delve into the day-to-day life of a French soldier in World War I. How were French soldiers equipped and uniformed? How did they view the war? And what were the key differences between French soldiers and the men from the English-speaking world? We discuss all this and more. Well, normally I would say hello Dan, but today, James, it's just you and I, because unfortunately Dan isn't available to record today, and so rather than being a three-stack, we're doing it as a pair instead. But it's a real pleasure to be joining you again on the podcast to continue our exploration of the French army in World War I. And today's topic, we're perhaps moving away a little bit from what we've been talking about, where we've been carrying or travelling with the French army through its major battles, to delve into, I suppose we might say, the nuts and bolts of the French army. And it's a subject I think is going to be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, very excited to join you and talk about this. It is something that I think people will recognize. There's going to be a lot of similarities with the armies, the topics they feel that they've been more exposed to, but there's also some key differences, and we've hit on them in previous episodes. But I think there'll be some new information here as well that folks will see sets the French army apart from other forces on the Western Front.
I think so, and one thing before we even dive into this topic that I just want to remind ourselves and our listeners of is we live in a world now in the 21st century with international travel and international communications. The fact that I'm talking to you and you're in the United States right now exemplifies that. And meeting other nationalities is a common experience for most of us, I would think. In the world of the First World War, this isn't the case. It's absolutely possible, indeed I would say most likely, that if you were a British citizen or an American citizen, the chances of you meeting a Frenchman in France outside the circumstances of war would be very, very unlikely. The vast majority of the European populations, as in certainly from the English-speaking world, did not interact with mainland Europe very much. And so, in some ways, in the First World War, this was going to be the first major exposure of British, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, Americans to the French, and vice versa. And we take this for granted now. At the time, it means that there was an element of culture clash that perhaps we are apt to forget about now, which I think makes the study of the nuts and bolts of the French army so fascinating. And just before we really get into the day-to-day life of the French army, James, I think one thing for us to discuss a little bit is the scale of French mobilization in the First World War, and just the extent to which this nation calls upon its manpower, because the numbers are pretty spectacular.
Yeah, it is something that is unmatched in really the English-speaking world. France, as we've said in the earlier episodes, being invaded, not even under direct threat, but being invaded. And having the experiences that France has had throughout the 19th century means that France relies on conscription, and it is universal male conscription. So 8.5 million men out of a total population of 40 million. So that's 20% of the nation being under arms sometime between 1914 and 1918. And as we mentioned in an earlier podcast, normally before the war, when you reach 20 years old, that's when you're called up and you do your 2 or 3 years of active duty service before you go into the reserves. But throughout the war, they lowered the age. They call up classes earlier, so you'll have soldiers as young as 18 and then men as old as 50. And those soldiers could be serving together in frontline infantry units. And the infantry foot soldiers represent 75% of all of the French forces. And they're suffering a 26% death rate and a 40% wound rate. So you have over 1 out of 4 chances if you're serving in the infantry, which 75% that you are, 26% that you are going to be killed in action or missing in action. And you've got 40% chances that you're going to be wounded. Many soldiers are, of course, wounded more than once and return to the front. So 65% total casualty rate for the infantry. Not very good odds. And I know there's been a lot of back and forth with British historians as well as American historians over, sort of the Blackadder expectation of everyone was killed. Everyone was wounded. It was a horrible experience. But in the case of the French army, it's true. 65% casualty rate. So it is absolutely astounding. 1.5 million killed and another 3 million wounded throughout the course of the war. And just for a larger context, this might be a little bit more applicable to Americans, but more French soldiers die in the First World War than the United States lost in all of its military engagements in the 20th century put together. So it is absolutely insane for comparison for folks who have vacationed in France, traveled to France. If you go to any small village, every town has a war memorial, something that people in Britain might be a little bit more exposed to, but every family on these war memorials has a name on it, and in many more than one. So something that completely changed the French nation and French history and the French psyche as well.
The statistics are almost too much to take in. 20% of the nation under arms in the First World War, and the French infantry, a 65% total casualty rate. Absolutely staggering. And just to put a little bit of context in that, from a British perspective, the British total casualty rate, and this is not just infantry but all arms, runs somewhere around about 9% of all the men mobilized for army service. Much, much lower total rate than the French. And yet, of course, in Britain, it's rightly seen in the context as an enormous national event, and the casualties are enormous and tragic in their scale in Britain, but in France, they are of a scale much, much greater than her other allies. And something that really strikes me about this is what an immense national experience this is. First World War, an immense experience for all the combatant nations, including the United States in its context. But for France, and given its scale, given the amount of men who serve, and of course they don't appear as if by magic. They have families, they have connections, and by extension those families are engaged in the war, even if it's only psychologically engaged. This is perhaps the single largest national experience France has had in its history, I would think, James.
Absolutely. They are comparing and contrasting with the last major mobilization. Of course, the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, but then the Napoleonic Wars are really the last time where this many people have been called out and mobilized. So it had been some time, and it brought war back home to many parts of France that had not experienced it as heavily as others in the War of 1870. So it absolutely changes the French outlook on everyday relationships with war, everyday relationships with the military, something that had been historically strained during the later parts of the 19th century, as we've talked about, but also really sets this course that will lead ultimately both in how the military thinks about itself and how France thinks about its military, ultimately to June of 1940, which is something you guys will probably hit upon on your other podcast.
Mm-hmm. Interesting point, and one that I think we all do well to remember in the wider context of history, that the wounds of the First World War are still raw and vivid by 1940. But as you said, James, perhaps a topic for both sides of the wire. Just as we're talking about changes in the French army, I think one thing, and we've hinted at this, of course, and even discussed it as we've been looking at battles in 14 and 15, one thing to just discuss, because we've covered this quite a lot from a British and indeed an American perspective, is the changing nature of the French army. Now, all armies that start in 1914 look very different by 1918, but perhaps, certainly from a purely visual perspective, the change which the French army undergoes from 1914 with the red trousers and the brass buttons and the cuirassiers and so forth, to the French army of 1918 might be the most spectacular that any army on the Western Front actually undergoes. And comparing a soldier of 14 to a soldier of 18, they look like they're from completely different eras. And perhaps you could talk to this a little bit, James, about what are the key changes in just the basic French equipment over this period?
Absolutely. And the French army probably visually is the one that most rapidly changes of all the major combatants during the war. It goes from an army looking like it is fighting in the 19th century to a 20th century effective military force. They have uniforms designed mainly in the 1880s, just after the Franco-Prussian War, that they're wearing when war breaks out in 1914. And quickly, within the first few months, the first few weeks, the French are looking at new variations of uniforms, new variations of clothing. The French soldier is going to be wearing what's called a capote. That is the large outer coat that looks almost like something you would see in the 18th century with its turnbacks that you have to pin up. That is quickly redesigned. New cloth is brought in to try to cover up the bright blue as well as the red, the grands pantalons that they're wearing, including cloth from England. There's an English army cloth, as it's referred to, or just English cloth that the French are going to be using. It's the same that the British Army makes its winter greatcoats out of. So that sort of bluish purple you'll see many French soldiers wearing in 1915 and into 1916. They also have this sky blue, the bleu clair, which is going to be used until the standardization of horizon blue is made possible in the summer of 1915. And that's that color we associate most often with that mid to late war French soldier. And they're going to be going through variations of how the uniforms are cut and made as well. A fashion designer, Poiret, it's basically the same as having someone like a Coco Chanel or a very well-known fashion designer designing their uniforms is going to step forward to redesign the capote as well as other uniforms until they become more standardized with the model 1915, which comes out right about in the middle of the Battle of Verdun, Battle of the Somme. The French are going to be the first army that introduces helmets for everyone on the Western Front. In the summer of 1915, everybody is going to be receiving an Adrian helmet, which is that distinct helmet with the badge of service on the front and that crest on the top. They're also going to be updating their weaponry. The French are going to be leading the Allies in having units that bring forward more than just riflemen. So the average French soldier will be carrying that 8-shot Lebel rifle in 8mm, which at the time was, when it came out, was the weapon of the world, the first military weapon to use smokeless powder. Unfortunately, that's not very applicable by 1914, and they're the only major power that uses a rifle as the standard infantry weapon that is a single shot. You put in 8 individual bullets, and then it is a tube-fed magazine, unlike the clips that the British are using, the Germans are using. But they're starting in late 1915, to be implementing things like rifle grenades. They're going to be able to place a rifle grenade launcher, what they call a Vivian Bessière, a VB launcher, on the front of their rifles. They're going to be coming out with light machine guns, the Shosha, which I am a defender of, made out of bicycle parts at the Gladiator Bicycle Factory, literally stamped metal. That is going to become the first major produced light machine gun, and it's going to be used through the war, used by the Americans as well, who don't know how to properly use it, and that's where you get the bad reputation for the Shosha. They're also going to have 37mm rapid-fire guns, so these are these light cannons. So just to kind of give you off how this all changes, at the start of the war, a regiment, 3 battalions of men, are going to have 3,000 rifles and 6 machine guns. That is their armament. But by 1917, after the experience of the battles of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun, they're going to have 1,800 rifles, 36 machine guns, 108 automatic rifles, so those Shosha light machine guns, 576 rifle grenade launchers, and 3 37mm rapid-fire guns, plus an attachment of various trench mortars. So, unlike 1914, where you have just a standard infantry regiment armed with riflemen, by 1917 and going into 1918, the French infantryman is a very highly trained multi-armed specialist. And like the British, like the Americans as well, they're going to be able to call on support from heavy artillery, tanks, and aviation. So the French army, like others, but I would argue leading the pack, is rapidly changing. The amount of weight the soldier is going to carry also changes drastically. Just as an example, the average French soldier is going to be carrying about 33 kilograms of weight. And I apologize, I will be using kilograms for my American and British listeners. But it's quite a bit, and this could go from everything to your capote, again, this coat, your culotte, that is your pants. Everybody remembers the French Revolution, the sans culotte. They don't have breeches, but every French soldier here has breeches. Your suspenders, or for British listeners, your braces. Your shoes, your leg wraps. They do not use the word putty. That is a British word. It is leg wraps. Chemise, your shirt. Your underwear, a flannel wool belt, because the French army believed that keeping your vital organs warm was the key to health, a very 19th century idea, as well as other things like your cravat, your tie, and this you'll see every French soldier wearing one of these. It's just a piece of cotton you wear around your neck to prevent chafing on your neck from your coat, as well as first aid kit, individual identity tags. The French issue out bracelets for their identity tags, as well as one worn around the neck. And then, of course, all of the other equipment as well. So that includes another 7 kilograms with bayonet, your 3 cartridge pouches, 1, later 2 canteens. Gourde was the French army slang word for that. They end up carrying 2 just because of the lack of fresh drinking water at the front. They also end up carrying multiple musettes, haversacks as we called them in the English-speaking world, which would hold your personal items, but as the battles develop, those personal items sure do feel like a giant bag of grenades, because that's where they're going to be carrying quite a bit of those. And then all of the personal items you're going to be carrying in your haversack, which is your knapsack or your backpack in the English-speaking world. So quite a bit of stuff, not including your rifle, and then after 1915, your anti-gas equipment. So a very large amount of items, and not necessarily as concentrated as a British or American with a standard issue. Here's everything that goes in your pack. Close it up. It sits nicely. You see the French soldier, the poilu, and all these photos wearing stuff as they feel it's most comfortable. Not sort of the same amount of standardization, but a lot of weight. And it's going to change as they're given more weapons, more resources, and more tools. And so their appearance is going to change immensely over the course of the war.
Just what you were saying about the weight of equipment. So huge weight. That's about 72 pounds of equipment. And of course, people in the First World War, men in the First World War, are on average considerably smaller and physically weaker than we are now. That's a lot of weight for any of us now, if we're fit and healthy, to be carrying around into battle. If you are a French soldier, and perhaps you're, I don't know off the top of my head what the average height is of the French soldier, but let's say you're about 5'5", which is absolutely reasonable, and you're carrying 72 pounds of equipment. Goodness me, you're really going to suffer seriously labouring under that. And I'm glad you mentioned about the way that the French sort of strap on their equipment, however it's going to fit and feel, because one of the big things that comes out of British soldiers observing or interacting with the French is that the French look ramshackle. And to British soldiers, particularly common soldiers, if there's one thing, certainly from 1916 onwards, once training improves, or if you're a British regular soldier, you are trained to really work on making sure you're looking smart, your uniform's properly organised, your pack is set in a certain way, And your sergeants will tear your head off if you're not quite like that. And soldiers do, carry different bits of equipment and so on. But if you look at a photo of a British unit, especially as either it's exiting the trenches or coming into the trenches, it will usually be in smart marching order. It might be muddy and a bit dirty when they were leaving, but you can see the sergeants have gone up and down the lines and they've made sure everyone's looking smart. And one of the first reactions a lot of British soldiers have to seeing French units coming up to the trenches or passing by is, what a mess. I've seen them described as travelling circuses, because you can imagine a British Tommy who lives in mortal fear something will be slightly out of order with his dress and his sergeant's going to chew him out, seeing a group of French soldiers walk past with gear strapped to them however it's going to fit. And just these little differences are really striking to British soldiers who come from such a formalised world of uniform. And also because the exposure that the British Army has had to the French prior to the war, and even during the early part of the war, is largely through picture postcards, which have fantastic illustrations of the French soldier doing something brave and heroic. And of course, everyone's in spotless uniforms, everybody looks absolutely fantastic. And then you get out to France and, half a dozen French soldiers walk past you with their guns strapped to their backs and carrying pots and pans and this sort of thing. And eyebrows do get raised by soldiers and by British officers. But as you were talking about all the differences and this rapid change of equipment and the way that the French army goes from, in some ways, if you've just been a casual observer of it on the 1st of August 1914, you might go, well, it's not that different from the army of Napoleon III. But if you looked at it by 1918, it's a radically different army. But one thing that strikes me, and I think is worth diving into, is although the equipment will change, the training and so forth will change, well, fundamentally, in a 4-year period, the manpower is not going to change that much, in the sense that these are still sons of a certain era. And the French soldier has an outlook on life, and an outlook perhaps on the war, that I'm sure is a little different to British and American soldiers, and it's commented on, in fact, by the British and the Americans. And perhaps we could get into this, James, a little bit about what is the essence of a French soldier's outlook on the war, and perhaps you could say a little bit about their nicknames as well.
Yeah. So just like all countries and all of the armies going into the war, there's a wide variety of opinions. But within France, overall, it's this initial enthusiasm that you see and you hear referenced about in 1914 is really quiet. The French are expecting that at some point they're going to be going to war with Germany. There's an amazing book called August 1914 by a historian named Bruno Cabanes, which goes into what was it like in France in those first few days after war was declared. And in many places it's somber. They know that this is not going to be a bloodless conflict. In other places, of course, you see the waving of the flags in Paris, where men are going and volunteering, even if they are not eligible anymore or had not been eligible in the first place for military service. A lot of the foreign population in Paris, Americans, Armenians, Greeks, are going to all go together and join the Foreign Legion. It is very different. You have soldiers who very much want to get back against the Germans. They are very highly motivated, but they've been indoctrinated by the French teachings of reclaiming Alsace and Lorraine. You have others who just say, hey, this is the job, I got to do it. I go. You have people who are opposed to it, but go as well. Probably the most famous French account of the war comes to us by a soldier named Louis Bartas. He was a barrel maker, and that's actually what his account is called, Louis Bartas, barrel maker. And it's been translated into English over the past decade or so. He is from the southwest of France, and he's a socialist. There's a very large socialist population down there. The Socialist Party is very popular in France, and he's anti-war. But he still goes. It is his military duty, but that doesn't mean he enjoys it and doesn't mean he likes it. And so you have a wide variety of opinions. A lot of them are based on politics. This is why the French government tries so hard to create what they call the sacred union, the union sacrée, which is throwing away all of sort of your domestic rivalries, your domestic debates between the various parties within France to say, hey, our main focus is winning the war. We'll revisit this when the war is over, but now we are together, all French in a sacred union. And So you have all these wide opinions that are going to pop up at various points in the war. And when we get to 1917, of course, that is going to become a flashpoint, which will result in the mutinies of 1917, if you can truly call them that. But a lot of the French soldiers bring with them as a citizen army their pre-existing beliefs, their pre-existing ideas of the military, as well as on politics and the reasons for the war and what the war should conclude with. And that does change a little bit as the war continues and goes on and people experience the brutality of the combat. But for the most part, they're going to be referencing and calling back upon their pre-existing ideas of, a nationalism, or on the other hand of the side, socialism. Many soldiers will feel pity for the German soldiers on the other side, saying we're all members of the working class. Well, as others will say, well, that's the Boche, that's the hated Germans. But for the most part, French soldiers are going to be saying, let's get this job done and go home, until they reach a breaking point in 1917, as I said, which we'll get to. But on the question of what do they call themselves, going into the war, you have terms such as pew-pew, P-I-U-O-U, P-I-O-U, as a nickname for the French soldier. But then the most popular one we hear during the war is, of course, poilu, which directly translates to the hairy ones. So don't Google image search it. But it is a direct translation. And of course, you can say that poilu means, these soldiers were wearing heavy mustaches, beards, though beards are only really a thing in the winter of 1914 going into 1915, just like with the British Army or the German Army. Once gas becomes prevalent on the Western Front, you see the amount of facial hair slowly but surely shrink. But the French Army still absolutely wears facial hair, and you'll still see a lot of soldiers, if not a majority of soldiers, into 1918 with at least scruff or mustache and scruff. And that part of that feeds into the gas masks that the French Army are wearing. But I would say that poilu, in more than its direct translation, in terms of the spirit of the word, in English, it might actually mean something more like grizzled or veteran. For those of you who might know about the Napoleonic Wars, the Napoleonic soldiers referred to themselves as grognards, like the old fighters, the old hands. And poilu probably in spirit means something more like that than necessarily just the facial hair that they're wearing. So the French Army, it's a wide variety of people. It's a wide variety of, and they refer to themselves as this wide variety. So truly, the French Army, its motivation for fighting, though it changes throughout the war, like all other countries, it's a representation of the nation itself. So it's a representation of all the various political views that France has in the early 20th century. And all of these soldiers, being citizens of the country, are going to bring those views with them into the army.
Just as you were talking about how the French view themselves, and I like this distinction about veterans compared to newbies and so on. And one thing, again, just as an observation from particularly the British, is that the sight of French soldiers with beards and facial hair, which of course for common soldiers in the British Army is not permitted. You are not allowed a full beard through the First World War. And as an officer, for much of the First World War, you are expected to grow a moustache. But to see full bearded French soldiers is a cause of comment, especially from newly arrived British soldiers. And it reflects, I think, adding to what we were talking about earlier, French soldiers loaded down with ramshackle equipment and wearing beards don't look that formidable to the British when they're passing by and so on and so forth. So that this is a cause of a certain amount of commentary, I think, from British letters back home that leads, I would say, to prejudice, because I don't think that really emerges particularly strongly. The British soldier has a sort of grudging admiration for the French, with one small exception, and that's that the British, and also I believe this is true of the Americans, hate taking over French trenches. Because when the French are about to exit a trench and hand it over to another nationality, well, they're not going to go around and make it as clean as possible. It's not like you're handing over the keys to an Airbnb. They're going to clear out, and the British and the French do build trenches to slightly different specifications. And there's actually a wry joke that becomes almost a sort of myth and a legend amongst British soldiers that the French charge the British rent for occupying French trenches. And it's not true, but it's this story that comes around. And actually, it sort of wormed its way into British culture to the extent that in the centenary in the 2010s, I actually was asked by the BBC about whether this was true or not, which of course it isn't. But interesting sort of reflection about the different appearances and some of the different outlooks of the army. And on that, one thing that the British Army's interactions with the French are, although they do fight side by side at various times, generally that they are not integrated with one another, except really by circumstances in 1914 or in 1918. And so this means that the British tend to see the French army in passing. And although there are some crossovers, particularly with the artillery, where I think the Royal Artillery and the French artillery have very good relations, British infantry don't see that much of the French except behind the lines. And in some ways, what the average French soldier is getting up to and what they're doing remains a little bit of a mystery to the British. British rest areas generally won't have French troops in them. Maybe some crossover, but generally they're kept separate from one another because they're in different sectors. And so, to the British soldier, the French soldier is somewhat of a fleeting vision a lot of the time in the First World War. You're aware you're in France and there's millions of French soldiers, but you might not actually see that many. And one thing that is almost a complete mystery to the British soldier is what do French soldiers do for entertainment? How does the French army, which, as you've laid out, James, massively mobilised, suffering enormous casualties, how do you maintain morale? What do French soldiers do to maintain their morale, especially behind the lines?
Yeah, so just like the British Army, eventually the French are going to institute this system of a certain amount of time in the front line, a certain amount of time in reserves, and then a certain amount of time out of the lines. So, of course, when we say out of the lines, rest area, we all know that means a lot of training. So that is going to be taking up quite a bit of their time. Leave is something the French soldier is always looking forward to, but unfortunately does not receive in any substantial amount until 1917. Some French soldiers who are mobilized in August of 1914 don't get the opportunity to take leave until the early winter, or the late part of 1915, early part of 1916, just to give you how horrible that experience of leave within your own country is. And many of them will not have enough time to truly make it to the southwest of France or to Brittany in the northwest, so they'll spend their time in Paris. A lot of times in estaminet and in various houses. Of course, the French army, we do have to mention, does have legalized prostitution as part of the army, something that the American units that end up serving the French sector will quickly discover and talk about. Sports, also a key part. And I should go back to the Bordello de Campagne, the French army's brothels. Those are a predate the First World War. Those go back into the 19th century. And the thought process with them is boys will be boys. Let's make sure they're safe. And we'll make sure we'll keep them healthy and regulated. And the French army continues with that into the late 20th century, interestingly. The sports, of course, always popular. Football, pétanque, the sort of bowling sports, and also just a lot of drinking. The French soldier is issued quite a bit of alcohol as the war goes on, as well as being able to purchase alcohol behind the lines because the alcohol they're being issued is not necessarily up to snuff. Alcoholism does become a major issue in France when the army is demobilized at the end of the First World War. And they're going to be doing things like playing card games like Manille, which is kind of like a euchre-esque game, for those of you who might know that. Lots of gambling, lots of singing, lots of creating art. This is where we see so much trench art available today. And altogether, it is something that the French do not necessarily standardize to the same amount as the British. but certainly a very similar experience out of the line once you get into estaminet, as well as just recreation when it comes down to sports, personal theaters where the soldiers are doing some sort of play or performance, as well as creating trench newspapers. The British Army, of course, we know has trench newspapers, probably most famously the Wipers Times. The French are creating them on an unofficial level. So you've got some really interesting trench newspapers that come out on a battalion or regimental level that aren't necessarily regulated by the army and give you a little bit of a closer view into what these guys are actually thinking. And then, of course, you have others that are being censored, still being produced on a regimental level or maybe a divisional or corps level. And those are much more, hey, this guy did this brave thing. We're going to all celebrate him and we're going to kick the Germans' butt in the next battle, as compared to others that are saying they're joking, much more jovial. There's a great study that was done in the 90s of French trench newspapers. And there's some of our best insights into what these guys were actually thinking. And I'll make sure to send a link to it for those who check out the Dugout. So, yeah, it is very similar in many ways, but also emphasize a lot of other things that the British or American armies would not have focused their men's attention on in the time out of the line.
Really interesting comments there. And just to echo, listeners, if you're not already a member of the Dugout, do consider joining that. We've got the links in the show description. There's lots of interesting discussion going on there that goes beyond what we're discussing on the podcast. And that, of course, includes reading suggestions and so forth, which I know we get a lot of requests for, especially with the French material. To go back to what you were talking about, James, particularly prostitution and generally the French army's attitude towards sex is perhaps the biggest culture shock that certainly the British Army has to deal with here. The fact that the French have legal brothels and see, I like the phrase used, that boys will be boys. You've got a large group of young men. They're going to want to do what comes naturally to large groups of young men. The British Army, of course, never officially has this policy, and there is perpetual tension in the British Army and connected to British society and government about, well, what are their soldiers doing? And of course, the official line in Britain is that the soldiers are praying and they're reading and they are absolutely not letting their minds wander towards carnal desires. Absolutely not. There is no acknowledgement of this at a government level. It simply just doesn't happen. British soldiers do not have sex, except with their wives and sweethearts back in Britain. And just as an interesting point about how hard that line is pushed by the government, there is an example in 1917 where a popular pictorial magazine in Britain called The Bystander, which is pictorial and story magazine, it publishes a cartoon, which from memory I think it's meant to be Royal Naval Air Service pilots who are stationed up on the far north coast of France and operate in the Flanders sector. And there's a cartoon of a group of them, and they've received a particularly saucy French magazine called La Parisienne. And these young pilots and ground crew are eagerly surrounding this magazine, and they're extremely happy to have received it. And this was famous for having Kircher girls, the famous pin-up art of the day, which was enormously popular with all the combatant nations, actually, including Germany, even though Kircher himself was based in France. And these airmen and mechanics really excited. They've got this saucy magazine, and the caption is something like, we always await, we love to receive the post from Paris. This cartoon is officially censored in Britain, and the Bystander gets in quite serious trouble from the government because it's implying that, my God, British servicemen are reading naughty French magazines. And of course, by the standards of the 21st century, this is extremely mild material. And by the standards of the kind of things that go on behind the lines, it's extremely mild. But I think that emphasizes just this cultural gulf, really, between the British Army's attitude towards this and the French armies. And to add another element, listeners, some of you might know I collect First World War postcards. One of the most collected First World War postcards by British soldiers are the saucy French ones, which have pin-up girls, either in art form or in photographic form. And soldiers collect these, they don't post them necessarily. It might raise the eye of the censor if you're sending this, but they actually pin them on the walls of dugouts or keep them in their pockets as a sort of little bit of inspiration on dark and lonely nights. And I find that difference between the two is really striking culturally. But there's other differences as well, James, and one that I think is quite interesting is food. We've talked about food and the British Army and the American Army, for that matter, in the past. And generally, both the British and the American Army eat well. The American Army eats extremely well in many respects, but perhaps eats a little bit bland food. But armies march on their stomach. As the great Napoleon, French general of great repute, once said, or is alleged to have said. Can you tell us a little bit about the French daily diet that they have?
Absolutely. So the French army is going into this war with 3 standardized rations. So that's the normal ration. That's when you're just in stationary position or in containment, something like that. And then you've got a combat ration, and then you've got the reserve ration, which is, for emergencies going into a long period where you might not be resupplied. So for the normal ration in 1914, that is fresh bread. So the French army does have mobile bakeries, and fresh is let's put quotation marks around fresh. Baked at the front. Sometimes they'll biscuit the bread, which means that they actually double bake it so it gets a hardened crust outside, which will protect the core of the loaf of bread, and that will last a bit longer. By standardization, it should be about 2 pounds worth of bread in one loaf that you're going to share among 4 men. You're going to have some sort of fresh meat, about 400 grams of that. That could also be salted. You're going to have lard. You're going to have some sort of dried vegetables as well as rice. You're going to carry in these small cotton bags that are issued to you. You're going to have coffee, about 24 grams of coffee in a normal ration, as well as sugar and salt. And then, of course, at the start of the war, you get your half liter of wine per day, which the French soldier refers to as pinard. So that's like a grog as a slang word for it. And this is low tier stuff. This is not, I think house wine or table wine is too high of a class for this stuff. This is very poorly made wine that has been sitting in a train depot for days, probably in the sun. Might be closer to vinegar than wine by the time it gets to you, but boy, do these guys love it. You'll also potentially, if wine's not available, be issued a cider or a beer. Again, a lot of these soldiers are coming from regions that are not traditionally wine-growing regions. And then you're also given a certain amount of eau de vie each day as well, which is that hard alcohol. And a lot of that could be part of that reserve ration. So the reserve ration, which for the most part, you're not going to be eating unless your really circumstances are dire. And some of it you can't eat, just like in the British Army, unless an officer orders you to open it, gives you permission to open it. And that could be 10 pieces of what they call pain de guerre, so war bread. In English, we probably know it as hardtack or army biscuits. You will have some sort of beef bouillon, about 300 grams of that. Sugar, coffee as well. Dried fruits, a potage, which is like a dehydrated soup. And then chocolate in a metal tin. This is very similar to the British Army's emergency ration of chocolate. And it's mainly for the calories than necessarily for the enjoyment of the chocolate. And then either eau de vie or rum as well. You'll also be receiving, as part of your ration, a certain amount of loose tobacco. The French soldiers through the war prefers pipe smoking over cigarettes. They feel pipes are easier to use in the trenches than cigarettes. And you see some beautifully carved and decorated pipes that the soldiers will be bored and carving and putting unit designations or their names or saucy pictures to revisit that as well. And also soap. Be issued a bar of soap as well as your rations, just to throw that in there as well. So the rations of the French army in 1914, pretty standardized. I know we're going to have to go into the alcohol section of this, because some of the biggest myths of the French army in the First World War surround the amount of wine these guys drink. And let's be honest, it's a lot. And it changes as the war goes on. As I say, they start the war with about half a liter of wine. That will raise to almost a full liter by 1917. So that's one full canteen's worth of wine per man per day, or other sort of alcohol. This is not only because of the horrible conditions on the Western Front and the arrival of wine, the pinard, and, the soldiers sing songs about it, makes them happy. It is also because at battles like Verdun, especially, as well as the Somme, getting fresh drinking water to the men is become incredibly difficult. With this idea that the French soldiers are going to be having fresh bread, and they're going to be having what they would call the soup, le soup, which really means all of their rations thrown into a pot together and cooked, because that's how they're going to be eating it, is everything thrown together into one pot by one man and then carried up to the front after it's been cooked. Generally takes the form of a kind of soup, so that's what they call it. Even though, if you could be getting eggs behind the line, the French soldier would still refer to that as soup, slang for any sort of meal. This fresh drinking water, as well as this fresh food coming to the front, is going to become incredibly difficult given the conditions of the battlefield, as well as the amount of shell fire, the amount, ration parties are targeted by German artillery. It's not a duty you want to necessarily take. And so the wine becomes a key part of making sure these guys have something to drink. A lot of it's going to be watered down. A lot of it might be mixed with sugar. But it gives you a guarantee that you'll have something to drink in. You're holding a ridge overlooking Verdun, and all of your ration parties can only move by night, and even then they're coming under German artillery fire. Now, this does lead to a culture of alcoholism. And alcoholism, as I mentioned before, rises dramatically and becomes a massive social problem in France after the war. And French soldiers are going to be pairing this alcohol they're going to be issued with whatever they purchase outside of the line, though the price of wine is going to skyrocket in France. So it is a very sort of mixed view, and the French soldier is going to be known for having this wine through the war. If you look at a lot of surviving capote, again, these outer coats from the French soldiers, I've seen this a few times in archives and museums I've gone to, and even among collectors who say, there's a blood stain at the bottom of this capote right over one of the turnbacks there, and it's not. It's because the French gourds, the canteens, are notoriously leaky, and you could clearly see that's dried wine that is leaked out of this guy's canteen. So it is ever present. And just to give you a view of, the conditions of the food, we've got a few accounts that I think are particularly interesting. Simon Hastoy, who's a soldier in the 6th Infantry Regiment, wrote, At 10 o'clock, the cooks arrive. They're carrying the stew, a bit of meat and bread. You can guess what the stew's like. Always cold, because the poor chaps have had to carry it for 3 or 4 kilometers. Another soldier, Andre Pizard, remembered, we adopted the old habit of eating whenever we were able, in case we couldn't eat when we wanted to. And then, in the 15 men of each section, the soldiers are going to be passing out whatever food they've all managed to throw together, communal eating, and trying to get what they can out of it. And this could be rationed food. This could also be food, again, these guys purchase out of the line, either on leave or when they're in a rear area, and brought up with them in one of the various pockets they have to try to make life a little bit more bearable. Gabriel Franconi of the 272nd Infantry remembered that the art of the perfect corporal is the ability to divide a tin of sardines into 15 equal portions and still have some left over. Leftovers from leftovers. Make it seem as if there's a limitless amount. An army needs it to keep up morale. The cooks always sent up enough food for 15 men, and any surplus was shared out between those present. It really is this experience of try to live as best as you can, try to add on to the ration that's being given you. And the French soldier, through his ability to scrounge, through his ability to try to find the best, is going to be somewhat known for coming up with these very interesting concoctions of food, as well as slurping it down with the massive alcohol ration that they're issued.
You painted a really vivid picture there, James, I think, of the French eating. And of course, even now we associate France with its gastronomy, and the British observing of French soldiers eating and scrounging food, again, gives us some of the most vivid impressions, I think, from an Anglophone perspective. I'm glad you mentioned the soup, because I've read so many accounts from British soldiers observing the French making this soup, French soldiers making this soup, put anything in you can, make this, it could be good, could be bad, just throw it together, make the soup, and nothing happens until the soup's been made. It's a huge element. In fact, there's complaints at various times, particularly in 1914 when the combat is more mobile and the British and the French are intermingled at first. The French units say, well, we can't do anything until we've had the soup. And, feeding troops is, of course, important, but if you're a harassed British junior officer and a bunch of French soldiers, especially if they're territorials, older men with big moustaches saying, we can't move until we've had our soup, doesn't receive quite the same approval, perhaps, that the French may have for it. And just you mentioned about scrounging, and I'm very aware of time on this episode. I know this will be a subject we revisit, but I think one point to make, which often surprises people on the battlefield tours when they talk about it, is that French soldiers relative even to British soldiers, and certainly to Canadians, Australians and Americans, are extremely poorly paid. I don't quite have the statistics to hand. We did discuss these in the American episode, but the average French salary works out at about $20 a year. And so when the British average salary is about $89 a year, still low, but considerably better from the French. So being able to scrounge and negotiate and do deals for some eggs or some hens or this sort of thing is really crucial to French military survival. But as we come to the end of this, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, James, because you've painted a great picture of the French army evolving, changing, its entertainments, and so forth. I hope I've added something about how the British view the army. What do you think, if you can summarize for us very briefly, what is the essence of French soldiers' day-to-day life? We've said of the British soldier, and Dan likes to use a quote, that it's 90% bored stiff, 9% frozen stiff, and 1% scared stiff. Can you summarize for us the average experience of a French infantryman, for example?
I think it would be very much the same. You're not spending all of your time in combat, but the conditions that the French soldier are in are definitely worse than those of the British soldier. I would say the French soldier is a civilian in uniform. These men are bringing with them the ideas they'll have from home. And because of that, they might not acclimate to the army in the same way as a British or even an American soldier. For those of you who are members of the Dugout, I'll make sure to send these guys some photographs of French soldiers in camp. You see French soldiers in these sabots, which are massive wooden shoes that are common among French peasantry when they're lounging. You see these soldiers bringing them with them. The French soldier, not to play to the British stereotype that the British soldier has of it being sort of like a traveling carnival, a traveling circus, it appears like that. The French soldiers are, again, they view themselves as civilians who are temporarily in the military, and they are going to bring with them their lives. So whereas the British soldier might be getting an issue of hardtack or bread and he'll shove it in his pack, plenty of images of French soldiers moving up into the front lines in Verdun, and you can see everything they have strapped to their backs are bottles of wine, their sabots, these wooden shoes, and loaves of bread. They are trying to survive and adapt, and arguably more so than the British or American soldier who are part of these strict military regimens, the French soldier is able to make it more personable to him. He is able to try to, through the culture of the army, as well as through the fact that most of these men are civilians, they are going to slowly but surely try to make it livable, and they're trying to compare their experiences of terror, of combat, and of everyday life to what they know from home. You will see French soldiers from Paris describe incoming shells as sounding like streetcars, while you might have a soldier from a rural area talking about a tractor passing by. So it is very, very different, but very, very similar in the same way. And at the end of the day, if you read works like a comparison of interactions of all the three major Allied soldiers on the Western Front that Chris Kempsall wrote a few years ago, at the end of the day, the experience is very similar, and it's the cultures that they all come from that end up bringing with them the differences that will define the French as compared to the British, as compared to the American experiences. And I think just to leave as one comparative fact here, just to hit on a topic I am sure we will get quite a bit of questions about, which is, again, the legalized prostitution. The French army, of course, keeping their men safe, trying to make sure that as many as possible stay fighting fit and get the needs that young men have sustained and fulfilled. As comparison, 52% of all American troops that are stationed in Paris during World War I are treated for VD. And the AEF after the war believes 6.8 million duty days were lost by the entire American Expeditionary Force having to be treated for sexually transmitted diseases. So, although it might be a looser culture, it is something that, by standards of the day, it is something that it is French culture. And it is a culture that the soldiers bring with them out of the army, and it's a culture that they'll bring with them from their civilian lives into the army as well.
Well, powerful summary about this, James, and it's been a fascinating episode. We've run a little bit longer perhaps than we originally planned, but there was so much to cover, I think, and in many ways we've only begun to scratch the surface. But I hope, listeners, you found it as interesting and informative as I have, and I'm sure it's a subject we'll revisit. There's still elements to discuss, not least the French colonial troops and their outlook on the war as well. But all that remains to be said now is, thank you, James, for your time and your erudition. And listeners, if you'd like to keep this discussion going, if you would like to ask James questions or just talk in general about the French army or indeed any of our episodes, do check out the Dugout. The links are in the show notes, and we hope to see plenty of you there. Otherwise, thank you, James, and I look forward to our next episode.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
I'm being trusted with the technical end today, so if anything goes wrong, we'll agree to blame Dan for leaving me in charge in the first place. I'm sure the prostitution stuff will go down really well.
I was like, I may as well end with that, because I'm sure that's what people are mainly going to take away from this.